Alrighty, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific. My name is Callum. I'm a part of the Volunteer Services Department here at the Aquarium, and we get to do a lot of fun stuff like our Teen Science Café events. I'm going to let Jay come and speak a little bit more about that, but I wanted to address a couple of things. If you ever wanted to join us and volunteer with us here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, it's an amazing opportunity. Please check out our website at aquariumofpacific.org and find a lot of our different volunteer programs. You don't have to be a crazy adult. You can actually start with us when you're quite young. So you can join us as a family volunteer. You can join us as a middle schooler. You can join us as a high schooler as well. Join us, join us, join us. It's a lot of fun. And you get to help teach guests about what you might have learned even here at our Teen Science Café event. So maybe you can take this knowledge and share it with the rest of the aquarium and attendees to the Aquarium of the Pacific. So if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. But other than that, I'm going to welcome up Jay to come up and speak with us about our Teen Science Café event.
Hello, so I'm gonna wait for the presentation to load for a bit. Oh, well, while it's getting started, my name is Jana Lee, and I also have a nickname. I go by Jay. The Teen Science Cafe is such a friendly community, so I urge you guys to check it out on the website. I know Callum did a little bit of advertising for us, but personally, I think it's just a great experience here. And so I just would like to talk a little bit more about the Teen Science Cafe as a whole. So currently we are doing our Women in STEM who did their Research in Antarctica series, and today is our last event for the series. But next year we'll have a lot more fun topics available for anyone who is joining us via online or in person. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit, introduce ourselves for those who have been here or haven't. Just a raise of hands, has anyone been here to a Teen Science Cafe event before? Ooh, okay, I see some raised hands. And for those who are joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you guys, and thank you for your returning members. So just to introduce ourselves, we are a team of passionate teenagers who are positively influencing new generations to be involved in science. So we work with scientists to organize events for you guys in the local SoCal area, or for those who are joining us, another welcome to you guys, to learn more about interesting marine species and topics. And we had a great variety of speakers who has come talk to us this year, and I'd like to introduce Ditya, who would talk more about these interesting speakers.
Hi, my name is Ditya. I'm another member of the Teen Science Cafe. So today I just want to start off by talking about some past lectures we've had here at the Teen Science Cafe this past season. So we started off with our very first lecture in fall. Dr. Amy Moran talked to us about Antarctic pycnogonids, which are basically just sea spiders, and how they lived in the Antarctic. And then from there, we had a presentation with Dr. Margaret Amsler, and she talked about pelagic krill. And then our third presentation was with Dr. Roxanne Beltran, and she talked about Weddell seals. And then our fourth one was with Dr. Kristen O'Brien, who talked about Antarctic ice fish. And then our fifth presentation was with Dr. Chris Chang, and she talked about antifreeze proteins and how they worked in Antarctica. And then we had Dr. Sky Murray come in and talk about art, design, and environmental data in the Antarctic. And then from there, we had Dr. Erin Petit, and she talked about Antarctic glaciers. And our most recent event was with Dr. Deneb Karentz, who talked about Antarctic politics. So before we start off with our presentation, we wanted to do a quick little activity with you guys, which is called a turn and talk. It's something we like to do here at Teen Science Cafe. So when I say go, you guys can turn to the people next to you and just discuss one of the questions above. So we'll start off with the question, why is it important to protect marine life? So go, you guys can discuss. All right, okay. If everyone wants to come back together, would anyone like to share what they discussed in their groups? It's okay, we don't expect you guys to know anything. You can say anything you talked about. What about you guys back there? What did you guys discuss? Yeah, you guys. Oh. Yeah, that's really great. Yes, thinking about, extinction and how to prevent it. That's amazing. Yes. All right. So, we can go into our next question now. What do we think a protected area really is within the ocean? So, if you guys want to turn, ready, set, go. Okay, if everyone wants to come back one more time, would anyone like to raise their hand and volunteer for this question? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, those marine protected areas are just places for people to do research and just keep these animals protected, for sure. Yeah. Does anyone else want to share? Okay, we can go into our third question. What would you like to learn about in this event? As I don't know if you guys remember the title, this event is about marine protected areas, so anything you may not know about them, anything you want to learn, feel free to discuss. Ready, set, go. All right, if we'd like to come together one last time, does anyone want to share what they talked about, what they want to learn about? Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, just what really is the process and, what it takes. I'm discussing for the live viewers who couldn't hear you, but yeah, that's a great thing. That's definitely like an interesting part of marine protected areas, just how they came to be. Does anyone else want to share? Okay, we can move on to our next person. Sorry. All right, this is Madeline.
So we were just discussing about protected areas. So what is MPA? So MPA is a region designated for long-term conservation of nature associated with its ecological services and cultural values. So an example of an MPA is the Great Barrier Reef Park. So at the Great Barrier Reef Park, it protects diversity of the reef, and there's many species there that are currently threatened or endangered. So there's approximately 1,000 MPAs in the US. So now that we know what MPAs are, what's the importance of them? MPAs reverse human-induced ecological decline, and they also help restore endangered species populations. And going back to the example on the coral reef park, there in the coral reef has a lot of endangered and threatened species, and by establishing these MPAs, it'll help restore these endangered populations. Also at MPAs, scientific studies happen there, and tourism is also very big, and also sustainable fishing. And as you can see here on the picture, this is the open access water versus full protection of the MPA. So now I will bring up the next speaker.
As Madeline said, MPAs are marine protected areas, and in 2017, about 6% of the world's oceans were MPAs, and the goal is by 2023, about 30% will be, hopefully, a protected area. So MPAs they span like huge ranges of habitats. They can be deep ocean, coastal zones, tidal zones, estuaries, and the two largest MPAs in the world are in the Pacific Ocean. So the aquarium actually has its own example of an MPA, the Honda Blue Cavern. It's a replica of the Blue Cavern Point offshore, which is about 267 to 2,616 feet. And the Honda Blue Cavern replicates the shallow reefs and the kelp forests close to the shoreline of the Blue Cavern Point. Okay, Erica is next up to tell you about how they're protected.
All right, so as we just learned, MPAs are super important for not only preserving our natural habitats, but also for preserving all the organisms that depend on them for survival. But if they're not protected, it's going to be really hard to make sure that they're doing the job we want them to do. That's where the National Marine Protected Area Center comes in. They work to enforce these MPAs, and they also work with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, which uses scientific strategies to implement effective MPAs in the future. So not only are they working to protect the oceans of today, but they're also working to protect the oceans of tomorrow. We can also do our part to help support MPAs too. First, we can rely on reusable goods instead of single-use plastics to help reduce our waste output and protect these oceans. Minimizing our water and energy consumption will not only save fossil fuels and reduce our resource consumption, but it'll also help reduce pollution that enters the ocean. Putting waste in bins specific to their waste type, such as putting recyclables in the recycling bin, will also help to make sure that we're using less resources and that less trash gets into the oceans. Lastly, we can educate ourselves on MPAs and how to support marine species, just like we are doing today, right now. So thank you guys for that. Now I'm going to pass it on to Zoe, who's going to help close out our presentation.
Okay, so just as we started our presentation, we're going to have one last turn and talk to close up the whole thing. First question that you're going to turn to your neighbor and discuss with is, what did we learn about MPAs? Anything you learned and everything you learned, and be prepared to share one fact that you liked that you learned from today. So go ahead. Okay, let's come back in. So who wants to raise their hand and tell us something that you learned from this presentation? Don't be shy. Yes? Yes, so NOAA does work close with the MPAs and managing that and making sure they're enforced well. Who else would like to share what they learned? Anyone? What about you in the gray shirt in the front? Yeah, so they are working to make 30% of the oceans MPAs, meaning they want to be more protected, and they want to be more well-known and well-protected so that we could preserve the environment. These are amazing things. So next question that we want to discuss, what was the most interesting fact that you learned about MPAs today? There were a lot of general information, but something that stood out to you. So go ahead and describe that and discuss that with your neighbors. Okay, bringing back together. Who wants to share one thing that they found interesting? Yes, up front. Yes, like as mentioned before, although the goal is lower right now, by 2030 they want to get even higher into the 30% of the ocean is protected. Did you have anything more you wanted to add? Yeah, so MPAs, a part of their protection of the environment and its animals is that they reduce fishing, they regulate that really strictly, who can come in, who can come out, just so that it's a lot more stable and, like an MPA's purpose, protected. So one last thing, are there any more questions that we want to know about? Any questions you have about MPAs or maybe just about ocean and marine life in general? Go ahead and discuss some questions that you may have right now. Okay, anyone want to share and ask some questions that they had? Yes? That's a really good question. So she asked, how do they enforce MPAs and how do they make sure that everyone is following these regulations? Again, these questions are going to be answered by our scientists, so make sure to ask any if you have them right now. Anyone else have questions? Yes? Oh, yes, that's a good question too. So he asked, how do they decide which areas become MPAs and which areas are allowed or are decided to be protected officially? So this segues nicely into the introduction of our very special guest today. She is our last scientist that we're welcoming for this year-long project of Antarctic Women in Science. Please welcome Dr. Cassandra Brooks to the stage.
Can you guys hear me okay? Is the mic on? It will be. It's all right. We're good? Okay. And if I forget those two questions to answer them, please ask them to me again. But how are they enforced and how do we decide what areas get protected? I'll come back to that. But thank you all for having me here tonight. Thank you for that fantastic introduction on marine protected areas. It sets up this talk really, really well. And what I want to do now is take you all to Antarctica with me. And so Antarctica is this icy continent at the bottom of the world. And what I want to share with you is that before the continent was ever discovered, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north, because they said without it, the entire world would topple over. And I love that metaphor because the Greeks were right. Because since its discovery, scientists have documented that Antarctica stores 90% of the world's fresh water, it regulates our global climate, and drives global ocean circulation. And despite its incredibly harsh conditions, Antarctic waters actually teem with life. In fact, Antarctica contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems left in the entire planet. And why do we have healthy marine ecosystems in Antarctica? Well, part of it is that it's really far away, so it's been protected by remoteness. It's also been protected by ice, but it's also been protected by political will. And I want to stress that in Antarctica, we have this amazing history of exploration and history of science where we've had international collaboration there since the 1800s. All these old expeditions would have people from multiple countries working together. And I want to highlight in particular the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, which was a scientific collaboration that led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. This was at the height of the Cold War. It was a very contested space, but this treaty actually came in and set aside Antarctica as a reserve dedicated to peace and science. The treaty is a beautiful document. It actually grants freedom of science. It prohibits military operations. It suspends any sovereignty claims, so again, making it very much an international space. It prohibits nuclear activities, so Antarctica is one of our largest nuclear-free zones in the world, and later agreements actually banned mining as well. So truly, truly remarkable international space that belongs to all of us, this Antarctic continent. Now, the waters around Antarctica are governed by a separate agreement that's part of the Antarctic Treaty System. And this agreement is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR is the acronym I'll use during this talk. And CAMLR, in line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, is considered a leader in marine resource management. And they currently have 27 nations that are party to this convention, represented by the flags on the screen behind me. Now, the waters around Antarctica are, you can fish in them, but fishing has to happen under precautionary science-based ecosystem approach. So there's a lot of strict rules around fishing. It's allowed, but it has to be tightly controlled, and again, it has to be grounded in science and precaution and to consider impacts on predators and prey. And so there's two main species, or two main fisheries in the Southern Ocean right now. The first is for krill and the other is for toothfish, and I'm going to go into those a little bit. But first, just to ask, has anyone ever eaten an Antarctic krill? Any of you? It's okay if you have. I'm not going to get upset. Have any of you that you know of? No, okay. Well, Antarctic krill, as you may have learned about earlier in the series, are a key prey species in the Southern Ocean food web. The Southern Ocean has tons of mammals, whales, seals, as well as lots of penguins and birds, and those large populations of animals all feed on Antarctic krill. So super important prey species, the most important prey species in the Southern Ocean. But they are mostly harvested actually for krill oil, like omega-3 oil. So maybe you have consumed krill, but you didn't know it. It's actually marketed as being from the pristine waters of Antarctica. And the other main food that it's harvested for is right here is fish meal. And so this is fish meal to actually feed aquaculture, feed salmon aquaculture, as well as feeding pigs and chickens and other livestock. So again, it's possible we've all eaten a bit of Antarctic krill, we just didn't know about it. But it's largely not harvested for human consumption. It's very much harvested, again, for these for pills as well as fish meal. So the thing I want to highlight about Antarctic krill is that the fishery has been growing in recent years. Part of it is this market of omega-3 pills that's become very popular. The other reason is that we are increasingly eating aquaculture, fish, as well as we do eat a lot of livestock. And so there's been increasing pressure on Antarctic krill and on harvesting it. And one of the biggest concerns right now for the fishery is that it's starting to interact and overlap more and more with krill-dependent predators, so with penguins as well as with whales. And what this picture is showing you right now is actually a recent study that came out just 2 months ago showing this massive fin whale aggregation, and that krill fishing vessels were actually targeting where the whales were, right? So they're directly overlapping, directly competing, and this is an issue. And you might know that whaling, we devastated whales back in the 1800s, and a lot of them are starting to recover, which is really exciting. And in Antarctica in particular, humpback whales have almost fully recovered, and these are fin whales behind me that are really starting to recover. And so we're having a lot more just direct competition between the krill fishery and these natural predators. And so that's something that we need to figure out. The other main fishery is for toothfish. So you guys said, "No, I don't think I ate krill." Have any of you ever eaten a toothfish? This beautiful fish behind me. They grow in excess of 6 feet. You can see by this picture, and 300 pounds. They're an absolutely beautiful, amazing fish. They are the top fish predator in the Southern Ocean. This is a place where we don't really have sharks in the high latitude waters, and so toothfish act as the shark of Antarctica. So they're also a really important prey species. This is a Weddell seal with a toothfish in its mouth. So they're very important to these seals as well as to whales in the Southern Ocean. So top fish predator, but also an important prey species. So they're not sold as toothfish. I guess that name is not very popular on the market. They're actually sold as Chilean sea bass. So if you see Chilean sea bass on a menu, that's actually toothfish, probably from Antarctica. They are not sea bass at all, and they aren't from Chile, but I guess that name is much more attractive than toothfish. They are a very much luxury item, sold largely in upscale restaurants and markets. But they are, again, these are toothfish, they're not sea bass. And because they're such a valuable fish, there is increasing pressure on this fishery as well. This fish was how I got my first love of Antarctica. This is beautiful toothfish. It was the first one I ever met, and I was so delighted that I did want to kiss it. This was me as a master's student up at Moss Landing Marine Labs in Moss Landing, California, and I was studying this fish because there was a growing commercial fishery for it in the Ross Sea, Antarctica in particular. And I'll show you a map in a minute of where the Ross Sea is, but it literally is the most remote fishery on the planet. So there's no further south, further remote you can go. It literally is the edge of our resources. And I was studying this fish so that we could learn about its life history. How old does it get? How fast does it grow? Because of this growing commercial fishery, and they wanted that information so that they could manage it more sustainably. But for me, I have to say that the first time I went to Antarctica, I was really shocked that we were commercial fishing there. I thought, why would we go so far away? Literally, fisher people risking their life and limb in the most treacherous oceans on the world. Like, why are we doing that? Don't we have enough fish at home? But the fact of the matter is we don't. And this figure, I feel like, sums that up really well. This is data from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization showing that by 2017, more than 90% of our global fisheries were either collapsed or fully exploited. And what that means is that there's very few places left in the world where we still have room to expand fisheries. And the Southern Ocean is one of those places. It's one of those places that hasn't been fully exploited for the most part, and it's why we are sending vessels literally to these last edges of the world where we started off fishing in shallow waters close to home, and we just go further and further away into deeper and deeper waters. This map just tries to summarize for you where the main fisheries are. The red circles are the main krill fisheries, and blue are our main toothfish fisheries. But a better map perhaps to show this is of all the countries fishing in Antarctica. And I'm showing this to you to give you a sense of how busy this place is becoming. Every flag is a vessel from that country that notified to fish. And so you can get a real sense of, particularly in some of these areas like the Antarctic Peninsula here, and here's the Ross Sea here, are getting quite busy with fishing. And in the midst of this increasing pressure to fish, we also have climate change happening. I'm sure if you follow the news at all, you've heard about rapid climate change happening in Antarctica and the impacts it will have on all of us, including from global sea level rise. And this map tries to summarize those trends for you, where areas in red are areas that are warming, where glaciers are retreating, where the ice shelves are collapsing. So this is the western Antarctic Peninsula that you might hear a lot about that's warming a lot. And then in areas of blue are areas that are a little bit less certain about warming right now, and those are the areas that are maybe more of a climate refugia potentially into the future. But my point is that we're facing this increasing fishing pressure, and then we're also facing this increasing threat of climate change in the Southern Ocean. And these impacts are not just on the land and the continent, but they impact the ocean a lot. And so we've seen potential declines in productivity, so declines in phytoplankton. We've seen declines in Antarctic krill and contractions in where they're living, and also declines in penguin populations so far. So what do we do? How do we maintain ecosystem health and provide for fishing, right? Provide for sustainable use of fishing. And thank you for the wonderful introduction, because one of our most popular tools now are marine protected areas, which you defined really well. Essentially areas where human activities are restricted to meet specific conservation, protection, or fisheries management objectives. And they're an increasingly popular tool for some of the reasons you heard about, including that they really work. They really, really work. And I love this figure because it shows you the difference between an area that's unprotected and an area that's protected, where in the unprotected area you have less life, and in the protected area you not only have a higher abundance of life, you have a higher diversity of life, you have bigger animals. Big fish actually have a lot more babies than smaller fish, and so you have just this flood of life here, and you have what's called a spillover effect, where the fish that grow here will swim out into the area where then they can be fished by commercial fisheries. And so marine protected areas are not just really good for the ecosystem, they actually can be really good for enhancing fisheries, and so good all around for everybody, if they're well designed, which comes back to that, how are they designed? And maybe most importantly for the Southern Ocean is that marine protected areas can enhance resilience, and what that means is they maintain all the different trophic levels, species diversity, genetic diversity, and so that can all enhance resilience to environmental shocks or environmental change, including climate change. And there's more and more studies coming out showing this, that marine protected areas, if you reduce those other stressors, then the system is more likely to be able to adapt to change. And this is what's really important in the context of Antarctica. And in line with CAMLR's leadership, so again, CAMLR is the multinational body that manages the Southern Ocean. They have been working on marine protected areas for more than 20 years, in line with some of the global targets we heard about. We heard about the 10% and 30% global targets. They've been working on that, which is really amazing. And just to know that what they're trying to do is have a system of protected areas that represent all the different forms of life in the Southern Ocean. So the only thing you need to know about the maps in front of you is that all the different colors represent different habitats on the seafloor, different habitats in the water, and we're trying to make a system that includes all those different colors, all those different habitats. And immediately when CAMLR started this process, a priority area for protection was the Ross Sea. And so I want to tell you a story about this place. So this is it on the map behind me. You can see the arrow. Again, it's the most remote fishery in the world. The closest landmass is New Zealand, which is about 2,500 miles away, so really, really out there. And the reason the Ross Sea was a priority area for protection is that in a global assessment of human impacts on the world's oceans, the Ross Sea stood out as being the healthiest large marine ecosystem left in the world. So you could think about that as it's the least damaged or most pristine large marine ecosystem left. And it also is the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean. This is actually a picture taken from NASA from outer space of the massive phytoplankton bloom that happens in the Southern Ocean every summer. And that massive bloom just leads to this amazing amount of life in the Ross Sea, where we have a disproportionate amount. We have 35% of the world's Adelie penguins, 25% of the world's emperor penguins, and just more seals and marine life in the Ross Sea than we have in other parts of the Southern Ocean. And I have to highlight the efforts of this scientist behind you, Dr. David Ainley. He's actually based in north central California, and he had been going to the Ross Sea and studying this place for decades, and he was making this case that we need a place left aside that's not going to be fished, that's not going to be damaged, that we can study how a healthy marine ecosystem functions. And so he began advocating for protecting the Ross Sea, and he began writing these pretty obscure science papers and submitting them to CAMLR, so submitting them directly to the managers and calling for protecting this place. And believe it or not, his obscure papers worked their way into the hands of this guy who is John Weller. He's a photographer based in Boulder, Colorado. And when John found these papers, it was a high school friend of his that gave them to him. And he was shocked. He was a mountain person and was shocked that we had damaged the oceans so hard that there was only this one place left. And he actually met with David Ainley, and they teamed up together, where David would be the voice of the science community and John would be the voice of the media. He'd bring the Ross Sea to the public. You can't bring the public all the way to the Antarctic, so he'd bring the Ross Sea to the people. And they started branding this place as the last ocean to really get it into people's heads that here's this last place left in the world that we need to protect. They recruited a filmmaker from New Zealand named Peter Young. A lot of the fishery for toothfish in the Ross Sea was coming out of New Zealand, so we were targeting New Zealand to be involved in this. And then at this time, I was finishing up my master's focused on toothfish. And the more I studied toothfish, the more I also realized they are slow growing, they are long lived. They have all those characteristics that make them vulnerable to overfishing. And I remember defending my master's thesis in front of my committee and saying, we need a marine protected area in the Ross Sea. And I remember them saying, you're crazy, it's an international space, there's no way that's ever gonna happen. And so John, the photographer, calls me up and says, we need to talk about toothfish. And he started talking to me about this Last Ocean project, and it didn't take long for me to really want to join on board because, again, I had already been on board with protecting this place. So John recruited me along with, as I mentioned, David Ainley, Peter Young, the filmmaker, and we would spend the next 10 years working on this effort. What I didn't know at the time was that John would then convince me to marry him, have his kids, and move to Boulder, Colorado, which is why I'm based there now as an ocean person. And so we got to work, and we created a flood of media, an absolute flood of media, again, to bring this place to the public. We created this award-winning documentary film, again, led by New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young. John wrote and put together this beautiful, critically acclaimed photography book, signed copies of it, and hand-delivered it to all the different governments that work in the Southern Ocean. And then we worked with international groups all over the world to create these policy documents that some of them are multiple languages that you could actually hand out to the different people working in this space. And then I wish I could say that we're enough to get the support of the public, but we did have to get support from celebrities who can really get the public fired up about this place. And then this is a scene of the public actually outside the meeting. So CAMLAR meets every October in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. That's an island off of southern Australia. And they meet there only once a year to make policy decisions. So you really just have one window every year where they negotiate. And the public is not allowed in the room. It's all governments. And this is a picture of the scene outside of CAMLAR of the public out there protesting, holding signs in multiple different languages. The binoculars are saying, we're watching you. We know we're not allowed in the room, but we're watching what you're doing. We want you to protect Antarctica. So this is just an example of how much we also were able to get the public engaged in this effort. And then over the course of many years, led by David Ainley, we produced this flood of science in support of protecting the Ross Sea, just making the case again and again for why this area is important to be set aside and showing some of the changes that potentially will happen if it's not. And incredibly, in 2010, the United States and New Zealand worked together and began developing a proposal, like an actual policy proposal for a Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. And so how they did that, what areas they chose, there's a lot of science that went into that, like an incredible amount of research went into what are the priority areas for protection, what are the areas that are important to toothfish, to whales, to penguins, to the benthic environment. And they came up with boundaries of what that would look like, which I'll show you in a second. And finally, in 2012, they brought this proposal before all the governments of CAMLAR to decide on. And now I want to take you a little bit inside the room. So this is inside the room of CAMLAR, and at the time of the Ross Sea negotiations, it was 25 different countries, and they're all sitting around the table. And again, to remind you, every single country has to agree for a policy to get passed. So the United States and New Zealand can bring forward a policy on the Ross Sea, but every single country has to agree to it for it to get adopted. And so in 2012, I so knew I needed to get inside this room. I had worked as a scientist, I'd worked in the media and advocacy side, but I realized for myself I didn't know how the policies were made. We were doing this big effort, but we didn't actually know what went on inside the room. And I ended up going back for a PhD up at Stanford to get inside the room and to study this process, to try to understand how do we do a protected area in this international space in Antarctica. And I'll show you, I'm not sitting at the table. I managed to get a seat far back in the corner, like the furthest back corner of the room, and I'm sitting on an observer delegation with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, and they are the main body that is like the voice of civil society in the room. So they are a coalition of conservation organizations, including WWF and Greenpeace, that work on advocating for Antarctica. And so I managed to sit with them and study this process from the inside, which is really amazing. And I want to share a little bit with you about that process. So again, we have to get consensus agreement, and in the context of CAMLAR, that means everybody. It means unanimous consensus. And this is the proposal for a Ross Sea protected area that came to CAMLR in 2012. And you can see that every single half of the CAMLR countries supported that proposal. So you can see as the flags go on the map, that's countries that supported it. This is what the proposal looked like in 2012. And again, these boundaries are a mix of these areas are really important for lots of different birds and mammals and fish. This area is actually the main fishing ground, so that was left out of the proposal. And then some of these areas in the north were important for toothfish spawning. There's seamounts here. So that's how this ended up being decided to have the boundaries it did, was really based on a lot of what's important for the ecosystem. So again, in 2012, half the CAMLR countries supported it. If this was a majority agreement, we would have gotten it then, but it's a consensus agreement. In 2013, more countries joined in consensus, and if you pay attention to the map for a second, you'll see the big change that happened in 2013 was a lot of these areas in the north were removed due to scientific uncertainty, some due to fishing interests, but these were taken out. But it did get the support of, if you look again at the consensus chart, you'll see it got the support of a lot of different countries. We had a special intersessional meeting in 2013 that got the support of even more countries. But that left us with 2 countries, China and Russia, still not supporting the proposal. And I guess I want to highlight that right now I've fast forwarded through many, many years of scientific effort at this point, and then 3 years of intensive negotiations, and we still haven't gotten agreement on the marine protected areas. So I want to ask why. Why do you think this was so difficult? Like, this is 3 years of negotiations. We had tons of science supporting this. We had the public engaged. And yet we weren't getting unanimous agreement. Does anyone have thoughts on why we didn't get agreement? Yeah, please.
Each country has to think of how it benefits their people and their economy as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's such a great point. Yes, it's like every single country sitting around that table has to think about that. Like, is this good for me and my country? Exactly. That's a great answer. Yeah. Yep. Gotcha. Yeah. So the way that the different products contribute to economies, or even maybe have food value, cultural value, etc. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes down to those trade-offs then. So each country has to evaluate what are the trade-offs with agreeing to protect this place. And closing down fishing or continuing to fish there. And actually for some countries, it's not even about fishing right now, it's about potential future interest in fishing like 50 years or 100 years from now. And so these are all the things that the different countries have to negotiate. And then at the same time, some of the years I mentioned to you, 2012, 2013, 2014, were pretty tense times. I mean, it seems relative to now, maybe less so, but at the time, really, felt like very tense times between the United States and Russia in particular. And so a lot of times, these negotiations in the room were not about protected areas. They were actually about bigger geopolitical issues, if that makes sense. And so those things would play out as well. And so it really came down to, in 2015, getting China and Russia's support. Those are the last 2 countries. And again, you need consensus. You need every single country to agree. So all it takes is one to object, and you won't get the policy adopted. So an amazing thing happened in some of the earlier years of this, where National Geographic and Pew Charitable Trust hosted an event in Washington, D.C. in 2013, and they managed to get former Secretary of State John Kerry in the room and show him a shortened version of The Last Ocean and get him really fired up about the Ross Sea. And Kerry decided he wanted it to be part of his legacy. And if you know anything about Kerry, you might know that he had a big passion for the oceans. He worked a lot in progressing ocean conservation, not just in the United States, but internationally. And when he learned that the US was supporting the Ross Sea, was one of the main countries supporting it, he decided he wanted it to be part of his legacy and to happen during his term. And he proved to be incredibly influential in getting the support, in particular, of China and Russia. And the stories we heard from our friends in the State Department was that Kerry was able to get Obama to incorporate a Ross Sea MPA into climate negotiations with China in 2015. And indeed, China comes to CAMLR in 2015 for the annual meeting and supports the marine protected area. They asked for some changes. They asked for this krill research zone to be added and some other things, a limited duration, but they did come to agreement on the marine protected area in 2015. So that left us with just Russia in 2016. And so a whole year passes, and during that time, Carrie's working in Russia. Lots of people are continuing to try to work on this. And we had this, what I think about as like a potential window of opportunity where Russia was isolated in 2016. They were the only country not supporting the MPA. And then Secretary Kerry's term was coming to an end. He was part of the Obama administration, and so 2016 was really this last moment for us to get this. At the same time, there was this opportunity for Russian leadership where Russia was chairing the meeting that year. They had designated a year of ecology. They were celebrating their anniversary of discovering Antarctica. And so there was a lot happening in Russia, too, that set the stage for agreement to potentially happen. And indeed, in 2016, Russia did join in consensus. And I honestly wish all of you could have been in the room with me on this day on October 28, 2016, when after more than 10 years of scientific effort, public engagement, more than 5 years of intensive negotiations, when we were in the meeting room, the meetings happened over the course of 2 weeks, and it literally was like the last night, the last moment of the meeting. And the meeting was going on, and they were having all these high-level, what they call heads of delegation meetings, where they kick everybody else out of the room, except for the top person from each government. So you have no idea what's happening. Like, you don't even know, are we getting close? And then we'd all come back, and it would seem like we had agreement, and then a country would raise their flag and not agree. And so this went on for 2 weeks straight. And so finally, it was the last night. We were all kicked out again. They were having a head of delegation meeting, and we come back in, and the chair, drops the gavel and says, "We have consensus. We've adopted a Ross Sea marine protected area." And in that moment, the room exploded in applause. Nations were hugging nations. Scientists were crying. Both John, my husband, and I were in the room for that, and it was this amazing moment where it wasn't just an incredible environmental win. Like, it was an incredible environmental win. It was like a gift to the future. As I mentioned, Antarctica is an international space, so it felt like this gift to the world. But it also felt like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty at the height of the Cold War. It was a diplomatic win. And it showed that despite political tensions, we can still do incredible things in Antarctica, that Antarctica is still an exceptional space dedicated to peace and science. And this picture is head of delegation of New Zealand. Her name's Gillian Dempster, and she's holding a map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area that the Kamler office printed after it was adopted, and they invited all the delegates to come sign it. So if you look closely at that map, you'll see Republic of Korea, you'll see Russia, you'll see Chile, you'll see Uruguay, you'll see all these countries and people coming up and sign it, and then you'll see John and I right there, where we signed it as well. And this map is actually still framed in the office of Kamler, so it was immediately a source of pride for this group. And I've highlighted my story and the efforts with the last ocean that we did, but I have to really say that this was a massive, massive global effort. There were diplomats from all the countries involved. There were hundreds of scientists, conservation organizations from all over the world working in this space, and then literally millions of individuals. And people did all kinds of things, whether they were hosting events in their hometowns, giving talks, doing media. This is a picture of Louis Pugh, who is a pretty famous swimmer who actually went and swam in the Ross Sea, swam a mile in the Ross Sea, and then went to Russia to talk about it, to try to get support for protecting this place. So there's just so many stories over these years of what people did, really sacrificing themselves for this place. And so reflecting back, because I do think there's lessons to be learned for all the other things we're trying to do today, including climate negotiations, as well as other environmental negotiations, or how do we get even MPAs in local waters? Well, in the case of the Ross Sea, at least, we really did work at the intersection of science, policy, and the public. And I really can't underestimate the huge role of public engagement, how important that was, the massive scientific effort that happened, the high-level diplomacy, the trade-offs that had to happen over negotiations, the building trust, breaking trust, rebuilding trust, and working with opportunities of leadership, which all really led to what felt like this political window of opportunity. And I guess the other lesson from that is that You sometimes don't know when a policy window will open. You don't know when you'll have that opportunity, but I think what we learned is you have to be ready for it. You have to have the science in place, you have to have the public engagement piece and the media. This is like the role of art and media as well, and be ready for when that policy window opens, because you don't always know when that will be. And so the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area really is just a start. You can see it here. There's another marine protected area in the South Orkney Islands, but it really is just the start of this journey where CAMLR committed to a network, so a network of Southern Ocean marine protected areas that would be across Antarctica. And I want to share with you that there's 3 more proposals on the table. So there's one in the East Antarctic here, the Weddell Sea, as well as the Antarctic Peninsula. And they're all incredibly important to penguins, to flying seabirds, to seals, to whales, to the benthic environment, to the toothfish, to the krill. They're all these critically important areas that have been chosen because of their importance to biodiversity and to the ecosystem. And I want to share with you that something really exciting is happening just next month. I told you CAMLR meets in Australia every October, but last October they agreed to an intersessional meeting. They agreed to a special meeting focused on marine protected areas that will happen in June, so this is just next month. It's going to be in Santiago, and I'm very excited about it because all we'll be doing at that meeting is discussing those protected areas that I just showed to you. And so we have this real opportunity to do some work in this next month. And so all these folks I work with are continuing that high-level diplomacy, the scientific effort, but I want to highlight for all of you, hopefully I made it clear that the role of the public is huge, the role of individual people who speak up and get educated. And so I've shared with you the main groups that are working on Antarctic conservation issues at the bottom of the slide there, and then this hashtag call on CAMLR, which is still active, of trying to call on CAMLR to adopt the marine protected areas that they have been developing. And I have to close by sharing with you that this certainly has become personal at this point because we want our son, Orion Ross, who's named for the Ross Sea, and our daughter, Adele, who's of course named for the Adele penguin, to be able to live in a world thriving with Adele penguins. And we know marine protected areas are an effective tool for doing so. So with that, I will thank you so much and look forward to questions or discussion.
Wow, that was amazing. I heard this presentation before, but listening to it again
In person.
and just kind of in person, right? It's a little bit different. Amazing job. Thank you so much for sharing and for all of your work. Can we give her one more round of applause? Thank you. Yes, so we do have a little bit of time for questions. Why don't we go ahead and answer any questions if you guys have some. I see some hands down here as well. If you have some that you're thinking of or that didn't get answered before, that's okay as well. But yes, go ahead, Ditya.
So you did an amazing job of going through the whole process of how you get an MPA, just how it comes to be. But I had a question on how do you maintain an MPA? Is it just do you just trust that other countries will?
Right. No. No, it's a great question, and that gets to the question that was asked before about how do you enforce or how do you manage, and monitor MPAs. So, so it depends, right? So in the context of some of the protected areas you all talked about, like in California or the United States, there's different bodies in charge with that enforcement and monitoring, like NOAA, right? In the United States would be in charge of it. In the context of Antarctica, it's a lot more complicated because it's an international space. And so the way that it works, for example, in the Ross Sea, is that different countries have to be willing to put the effort and the resources towards research, monitoring, enforcement. And so for the Ross Sea right now, New Zealand does a lot of surveillance. They're close, relatively close, and so they'll do flyovers. As well as the United States has a big science base in McMurdo, which they fly to from New Zealand, and so a lot of times these planes flying over can check. And what I can share with you, we had our first 5-year review of the marine protected area. It's 5-year birthday last fall, and no illegal fishing has been reported in the protected area, which is pretty amazing. So it means that at least in the context of enforcement, that seems to be working. The harder question is the protected area meeting its goals? Is it meeting its conservation objectives? And it has a series of conservation objectives that all revolve around protecting the ecosystem structure and function, including in the face of fishing and climate change. So trying to have a protected area that actually keeps the ecosystem integrity intact, if that makes sense. And I've been part of the efforts that's trying to compile all the science that's happening in the Ross Sea to understand, is it meeting its objectives? And what I can say is we don't know. And so we had this 5-year review. We tried to see what the indicators are, but I think it hasn't been in place long enough for us to see, like, is it meeting its objectives? You've probably learned through the series, Antarctic animals live a really long time, and so like 5 years is not really enough to say, like, is a change happening? And then again, we have these crazy changes happening from climate change, and so trying to disentangle what is the impact from fishing versus climate change is really difficult. But that's what we're trying to do. Like, we're really trying to get organized around research and monitoring, and the main countries doing that is United States, New Zealand, Italy, and South Korea are like the main kind of leaders who have science bases down there. So yeah, so we're trying to to work on it. Thanks. Thank you. Great question. Right, great question. So yeah, there's a long history around Antarctica of like who is a member of the treaty and CAMLAR, and like should it be a United Nations thing? So it's not a United Nations thing. That was discussed at a time. So originally the treaty was just 12 countries, and it was just the countries who did research in Antarctica. So they all had bases or were involved in some other way, and then that's grown over the years. And so the list of countries you see are those that are involved in science, or those who, for the case of CAMLAR, those involved in fishing or trade of fish. And essentially it's the countries involved in the Southern Ocean is how it goes. And there's definitely criticisms around that it's an elite group of countries, right? And that it's a global commons, so it should be everybody. But so far that's how it has worked. And in some ways, it works in the sense of the countries involved have a vested interest in being involved because they care about conservation, or they care about the political aspects, or they care about the fishing, versus like a UN level thing, which I think would be really difficult to do. But it's definitely this tricky thing, and that's why it's a smaller number of countries, like very small number, relatively speaking. Yeah. Yeah, please. How are new in Antarctica? Yeah, globally. So usually what happens is like a country or a state has to like have the political will, right? So they have to be part of their sort of policy framing, which in the US we have like a really big, actually Biden agreed to, you may have all heard this, but he agreed to 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of our lands and oceans by 2030. So we have a nice agenda that allows us to do that. Not every country does, but so you need that political will. And then once you have that, you have scientists work to gather information on what are the most important areas for biodiversity. And then often there's a process of stakeholder engagement, so working with the fisher people, maybe the people involved in mining, like what are the different interests that people have, and work with them to try to negotiate, okay, these are the boundaries that are important for biodiversity, but where are the areas that we need for our livelihoods, right? And so that usually happens, and then you end up with boundaries that then can get adopted. And often protected areas have different levels of zones. So the strictest is no take or no go, like you can't go there at all. Sometimes there's fishing zones, like even the Ross Sea protected area is 80% no take, but then there's 20% that like allows for some fishing. And so usually MPAs have some element of that where there might be areas that activities are still allowed. So that's like a whole other, a whole other thing. Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. So the question of, how did I get to that place in the room? So I'm very much an interdisciplinary scientist. I was trained as a biologist and a marine scientist, and then went, like I said, into media, and then went into environmental policy. So I think I've always been a person who wants to figure out like the way to have impact. And I think I thought, oh no, it's science. Then I was like, oh no, it's public engagement. Oh no, it's policy. And now I've learned it's all of that. It's all of that. And not everybody can work across all of that. I think I feel like I'm like not great at any one thing, but I'm really good at working across across things, if that makes sense. And so I found like my superpower, I guess. And I feel like everybody has their like superpower, and it's about finding it. And I feel like the getting in the room thing was just, you all probably know this from your life experience so far, but it was really like building relationships with people. And I feel like doing a lot of you know, following your own integrity and really like building authentic relationships with people, and then building trust with people, so that then when you want to approach them about going in the room, you get to do that, if that makes sense. But it was, I mean, I feel like it was a lot of really hard work, and yeah, building relationships that made a big difference for me, and finding your superpower. Thank you.
Any last questions? Speak now, forever hold your peace. No? Okay, well, thank you again. Can we just give her one last round of applause? Really appreciate you for coming all this way, flying all this way to come and share your insights with us. Amazing things. I think there's a couple of things that I took away from this. You did speak a lot about public engagement and how the public plays a big role in protecting Antarctica, all the way from who knows where you're from, right? Millions of miles away from Antarctica. There's ways to do that. And one thing that I'm just so proud of is watching these teens here. This is their last Teen Science Café event. Some might not ever do another Teen Science Café event. The very last, they're graduating and leaving us. I'm going to miss them so much. But what was so cool for me today, in particular, out of any other Teen Science Café event series or that we've had thus far, is in the first 5 or 6, they were stumbling on their words, they were messing up things, and they were, oh my goodness, let me start over, and right, there was all kinds of things. And this one, it just flowed. And I sat over there so in shock. So, I mean, imagine when it comes to being in the room and sharing your stories, you guys are going to be well equipped to do so, because it's going to roll right off the tongue. Anything that you have inside of you, you're going to be able to connect that, right, with people who are in the room, people like Cassandra, and people from all over the place. So you are all on your way to being in that room already. Some of you have been joining us for multiple events. Thank you all for coming. But same thing with you. You're making a difference. You're coming in, asking how to get engaged, right? All those things get you in the room to make impact, and you're doing it right now. So amazing to see it kind of taking place and happening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to take this time to wave goodbye to our live stream. Thank you for watching. We've had viewers from all over the world, so thank you again for watching with us today, and we will see you all later.